Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like you to stand by for an announcement by the President of the United States. My fellow Americans, I, like many of you, am deeply troubled by the accidental killing of 7 workers from World Central Kitchen in Gaza by an Israeli strike earlier this week. I say accidental because I was assured that this was not an intentional targeting. I've spoken with Prime Minister Netanyahu, members of my team, including the Secretaries of State and Defense, our National Security Advisor, have all been in touch with their counterparts in Israel. And in every one of those conversations, without any prompting from us, even before we said anything, Israeli leaders expressed their deep and sincere regret for what happened and took full responsibility for the action. They promised me that they would undertake a full and thorough investigation of the incident and that they will be taking measures to ensure that something like this does not happen again. They told us that the people who made the decision to bomb the aid convoy will be held accountable and will be appropriately disciplined. We have been assured at the highest levels that Israel is going to do everything it can to increase the amount of humanitarian aid and food going into Gaza. The truth is, my fellow Americans, I could not have asked for any more than this on the part of the Israelis. In fact, I've seen reports that more food is going into Gaza than ever before. The problem is that Hamas, which still governs the territory, uses the distribution of food as a weapon and won't let the poor people who deserve and need it get to them. Folks, listen, there's a reason why there's an old saying, probably older than me, that war is hell. That's because it is. Now, I'm reluctant to say this because I was kind of hoping everyone would forget it. But I was reminded by my aides and advisors that we had something very similar happen in the final weeks of our operations in Afghanistan, just a few short years ago. We tracked an aid worker's car for 8 hours because the car was seen at a compound used by ISIS. And our surveillance drone saw men loading what they thought were explosives into a car. It turned out they were containers of water. And so we wound up killing an aid worker, a food aid worker, and 9 members of his family, one of whom was only 2 years old, a couple of whom were translators for us. These kinds of things and these tragedies happen in the fog of war. So I want the American people to know, I know the Israeli people. I know their leaders. I know their values. And what happened pains them more than you can imagine. That is because they, like us, value life. This terrible event is not indicative of their values. It was a mistake. It was an aberration. It is not the norm and how they proceed. They're fighting an enemy that hides behind civilians. They're fighting an enemy, my friends, we must remember, that goes underground into the tunnels they built with the billions of dollars that we and other countries around the world have given them so their leaders can be safe while leaving their people exposed. Hamas uses hospitals, schools, mosques, and homes to store their arsenal of weapons, knowing that Israel will do everything it can to limit casualties and loss of the lives of non-combatants. The ratio of non-combatants, of how many non-combatants are killed for every militant or terrorist they take out is the absolute lowest in history. That is how careful the Israelis are being. I know what I'm about to say may be hard to believe, but Israel's enemy regards every death, regardless of whether it is someone on their side or on the other side, as a victory. This is why if Hamas truly cared about its people and their welfare and wanted to prevent future tragedies and further loss of life, it would immediately, without any delay, unconditionally release the 133 innocent hostages it has been holding for 6 months against their will. There is no justification for these innocent men, women, and children to still be held captive. And so I call upon the leaders of the world to join me and to recognize the nefarious, malicious evil that is Hamas, a proxy of Iran, and of how important it is to all who cherish freedom and value our Western way of life to join with us in hoping and supporting Israel so that they can be defeated. Thank you, and God bless America. Can you imagine what would have happened if the president made such a speech? Rather than give legitimacy to Israel's haters and detractors, rather than give oxygen to negative assumptions about Israel and to fuel and encourage anti-Semitism, it would have calmed the storm. There's a word for this. It's called being presidential. It is the kind of leadership and clear moral voice that is so desperately needed to remind people of the purpose and goals of Hamas, of who started the war, and why it is that Israel must continue to fight it. Having just returned on Thursday from Israel, my second trip there since October 7th, this time with an unbelievable group of 20 members of our congregation, I want to share with you some of what we heard and saw while we were there, and the messages that we were asked to bring back. We went on a mission of solidarity and to volunteer, to show that we cared, which we did through our meetings and on work sponsored by Sarel on an army base for several days, and working in an apricot field. While most of us are aware of the rapes, killings, kidnapping, beheadings, and hostage-taking that occurred on October 7th, there was another aspect of the attack that's been underreported. The Western Negev, the area that was attacked, is the breadbasket of all of Israel. It provides 70% of the country's fresh produce. And so the Hamas army deliberately targeted and sought to destroy Israel's agriculture. We saw some of the destruction. They burned or stole vital farming equipment, tractors, dismantling and disabling irrigation equipment, and doing so much more damage. They killed and burned animals alive. Among the hostages and those killed were foreign workers, foreign agricultural workers. Now, we may have thought that these people were unfortunate victims who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. But it turns out it wasn't accidental that they were targeted. The killing and kidnapping of foreign workers has driven away many, leading to a labor shortage, causing crops to not be harvested, which is why we assisted in an apricot field. Incidentally, the damage deliberately done to the environment by Hamas would be reason enough alone for climate activists and anyone who cares about the environment and ecology to oppose Hamas and not to be out in the streets demonstrating and marching on behalf of Hamas. It makes no sense whatsoever. The devastation we saw, the barbarism we heard of, the intensity of the assault, seeing homes that were burned out, is all unimaginable and indescribable, as was the heroism of so many that we met. I told you before, at the time of my granddaughter's bat mitzvah, about Rami of Davidian, who at the risk of his own life went into the belly of the beast, returning over and over to the site of the Nova Festival, the very field which we visited, and we saw where the killings took place. He went there to rescue children of people who contacted him on WhatsApp. Strangers he didn't even know, begging him to do what he could to save their child. How could I say no, he said. And so for almost 48 hours straight, without a break, this man, who was not a part of the IDF at the time, unarmed, took his small little pickup truck and with members of his family helping, went back and forth to find and rescue as many people as he could. At one point, as he came upon a young girl who he thought was alone, he saw that she was already captured and in the hands of Hamas gunmen. And so as he encountered them, he thought very quickly and without hesitation spoke to the captors in Arabic and presented himself and said he was one of them. He said he was a Muslim Bedouin named Abu Rami from a nearby village. And he told them they all needed to run away and escape as quickly as possible because the IDF was rapidly closing in on them. And then he said, you know what? The 5 of you should go and run as fast as you can, and I will take the girl
because she's just going to slow you down. And then they handed her over to him. She didn't even know who he was at the time, but by the time it was all over, his quick thinking brought her home, and he had saved 750 people. 750. He says that he walks sometimes in the streets of Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, and people come up to him and say, "You saved my life." He receives text messages. I think, and I speak for all of us, who went by saying we came away inspired and touched by the heroism, the decency, the resilience, the determination we saw. We met young soldiers as we worked helping to organize several containers full of supplies so they could be ready and sent to the front lines when needed. We met this young woman, a woman named Tamara Haimov, who put together an entire operation in the basement garage of an expo center so that needy families and soldiers would be able to receive much needed aid, everything from food to clothing to bicycles, as people sent goods there and volunteered to help out. And the distribution system was such that it was computerized, that they would get an order from anywhere around the country and try and fill it and send it out as quickly as possible. Elderly people in their 70s came and said, "We want to help, we want to do what we can to help our fellow citizens." And so they were enlisted as drivers. And a message we heard repeatedly, in addition to thanks, was the request for us to come back and tell the stories we heard. We are now all ambassadors. We are witnesses to counter the impressions left by the media. And what, on more than one occasion we were told was fake news about what was going on. We saw pipes that were supplied by the West to be used for irrigation and for agricultural purposes, which were converted by Hamas into rockets of destruction sent into Israel. They've inverted the words of the prophet Isaiah, found on the Isaiah wall across from the United Nations. They shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Instead, Hamas has taken plowshares and pruning hooks and has turned them into swords and weapons of war. As some of you may have heard, there are some cracks in the absolute unity that was so apparent in Israel in the immediate aftermath of the attack. But regardless of how people may feel about various issues, which is only natural, there was consensus, consistency, and agreement that the hostages must be released, that Israel must defeat Hamas, and that not be allowed to allowed to remain as a governing force in Gaza. And that in order to accomplish all of this, so many said to us, Israel's going to have to enter into Rafah. And so we need to be aware and ready to understand that. The residents of the very area of the western Gaza area, of the western Negev that were attacked, and of those attending the music festival, ironically, were among Israel's strongest advocates on the left, advocating for peace and accommodation with their Palestinian neighbors, often sending kites across into Gaza as signs of hope. Some have changed their positions, needless to say. Yet even those Israelis who believe that Palestinians should have a state of their own, which most are not willing to discuss at this time and which is not appropriate to discuss at this time, not say that they advocate and want them to have a state, not because of any sympathy or any kind of love they have for them or for their cause, but simply because they want to have nothing to do with them anymore. We came away thanked for coming and showing that they, Israelis, are not alone, appreciative of our support. The prevailing theme, Yachad Ninatseach, was still felt. Together, we will prevail, or together, we will win. Those words refer to united not just together of Israel, but that together, the unity between the Jewish people, the solidarity felt by Jews all around the world. As we were picking in the apricot field, there were a bunch of French young women who came in order to help as well. So this kind of unity of Jews around the world, Yachad, that's what that means. Together as one people, Ninatseach, we will win, they said, so that Israel will be able to live in peace and in security, and the words of the prophet may come to be fulfilled. And let us say, Amen.